Hi, welcome back to Elite Literary Book Group. I'm Rachel Beck, and we are at Melchester, Part 3, or Part the Third. And this is where we're going to get more into Sue. So if you've been reading, and I hope you have, I promise you it's going to start picking up. Victorian novels take a very long time to get into. But, you know, I commend you if you're really sticking with it, because it's not an easy thing to do, but you kind of acquire a taste for it once you start, and it seems like nothing else really compares to it. If that's what you start reading more of, then all of a sudden it's like your expectation of books is going to go way up. But before I get into Sue, I just want to say something about Jude. Now that he's back home, and he has, in the very beginning of the chapter, it says he has this new idea. And let me just read this part. It was a new idea, the ecclesiastical and altruistic life as distinct from the intellectual and emulative life. A man could preach and do good to his fellow creatures without taking double first. There were thousands of young men on the same self-seeking track at the present moment, but to enter the church in such an unscholarly way that he could not in any probability rise to a higher grade through all his career than that of the humble curate wearing his life out in an obscure village or city slum, that might have a touch of goodness and greatness in it. That might be true religion, and a purgatorial course worthy of being followed by a remorseful man. Okay, so now, you know, he's thinking maybe wanting to get a degree, a doctorate, or whatever it would be at that point, to be a priest, you know, high up in the church. You know, maybe that was more ego than anything else. Maybe what I really want is just to be like a humble clergyman. And what I'm thinking, I'm not very familiar with his term for the curate, but I'm thinking like a deacon, somebody who's an assistant to the priest. Still part of the clergyman, can still minister to people, but you notice that the word there is a touch of greatness there. It's not completely devoid of the human longing to be somebody. You know, even if it is, I'm going to be a monk, I'm going to be real spiritual, it's still, there's an identity to that, and there's that one, which is perfectly normal for someone, you know, who's really young. I mean, we all are kind of like that. And you do get a hint that, you know, if you've watched previous videos, I sort of guessed that he was getting closer to 30. I couldn't remember. And his scheme is that he would be done with this license by the time he was 30. And Hardy says it was kind of an exemplar when he first began to teach in Galilee. So he's making a reference to Christ, because Christ was about 30. So you have that. Okay, so meantime, Sue has a Queen Scholarship, and she's going to Melchester, and she's going to have to be there for a couple of years, and it's going to be a really rigorous training. But the problem with where she's going to be is it's not going to be that different from where she came from. It's still a very strict, religious, very structured. And this kind of shows you, I mean, like, if you think you're going to go off to college, you're probably thinking about freedom. And especially intellectual freedom. I mean, you should kind of feel like you can explore things freely. In this kind of society, you couldn't. And Hardy makes a point several times that the two are very, they're like, at one point Sue says, you know, it's like two rams together, the spiritual side and then the religious side, which was very legalistic, and they're like butting each other's heads and they're not getting anywhere. So once Sue gets settled there, she starts to find that this is just as oppressive as anything else. And for the plight of the Victorian woman, if you think about it, there is no for what they're allowed to do on their own, there is no freedom for them. There is no, I'm going to go get an apartment and live by myself and get a job. You can't do that. You're going to live with your family forever. Maybe grow up to be an old maid, but you're going to be taking care of somebody. That's just part of it. You can't be on your own. And this is, I think Hardy was very sympathetic to women about this. And I'll show you with some conversations that, or throughout the text, where he does mention about, you know, what it really is like for women during this time. So she writes him, and she's anxious, and she says, I think I regret coming. I wish I wouldn't have let Phillotson talk me into this. And that kind of gives Jude a little bit of hope, because he thinks, well, maybe she'll be upset with Phillotson, and she wanted him to come. And you see with Sue, she does things that are very impulsive. She could want him to come one day, and then by the time he got there, she may have changed her mind. So it's kind of a mixed feeling of when he sees her, when he first, you know, he doesn't know for sure if she really felt the same way as she did when she wrote the letter. Okay, but he asked, you know, can I take you somewhere and buy you a present? When he finally gets there, and she says, no, I'm just actually really hungry, because they don't let us eat very much. They don't let us indulge in anything. That means you can't indulge in food for a pious life, you know. So she's starving, and he takes her out to eat. And then she makes a comment, like, he keeps waiting to see what's happening between you and Phillotson. That's what Jude really wants to know. And she says, well, maybe I'm glad I went to this training school after all, because I'll be independent, and then Phillotson's going to use his connections, and he's going to get me a job. And Hardy writes, she had touched the subject at last, Phillotson. And so Jude has to say, you know, I've had a suspicion, a fear, that he cared about you rather warmly and perhaps wanted to marry you. Now don't be such a silly boy, says Sue. He has said something to you about it, I expect. If he had, what would it matter? An old man like him. Oh, come, Sue, he's not that old. And I know what I saw him doing. Not kissing me, I'm certain. No, but putting his arm around your waist. I remember. But I didn't know he was going to do it. You're wriggling out of it, Sue, and it isn't quite kind. And she gets kind of upset, and she says, I know you'll be angry if I tell you everything, and that's why I don't want to. Very well then, dear, he said soothingly. I had no right to ask you. I don't wish to know. I shall tell you, she said, with the perverseness that was part of her. This is what I've done. I've promised. I promised that I would marry him when I came out of the training school 2 years hence. And I've got my certificate. His plan being that we shall then take a large double school in a great town, he the boys and I the girls, as married school teachers often do, and make good income between us. Oh, Sue. But of course it's right. You couldn't have done better. And so even Jude knows that even though Sue is not your typical girl at all, the same rules still apply for Sue. She still is going to have to get married at some point. And he even knows, just because she's got different manners and has been to London, she's still poor. She still comes from a poor home. And so he says, you couldn't have done better. And that's really the reality of it in a marriage. And then she says, I knew you would be angry, she said with an air of no emotion, whatever. Very well, I am wrong, I suppose. I ought not to have let you come see me. We'd better not meet again, and we'll only correspond at long intervals on purely business matters. Now, it's questionable what business matters these two would actually have in corresponding. But Jude's response to all that is, I don't care if you're married. No one is going to stop me from seeing you. And he means it. And so that's only going to cause a little bit more trouble. So they go out, they finish that, so now he knows, and he suggests they go to the cathedral. And of course she does not want to go to the cathedral. She says that's the center of the town now. The cathedral has had its day. And he says, how modern you are. So would you be if you had lived so much in the Middle Ages as I have done these last few years. And I'm not modern either. I'm more ancient than medievalism, if you must know. There, I won't say any more of that, she cried. Only you don't know how bad I am, from your point of view, or you wouldn't think so much of me or care whether I was engaged or not. Now notice that Sue beats up on herself in sort of the same way Jude does. She, in one moment, she could just be completely free and spontaneous, and like when she went to go buy these Greek figures, Venus and Apollo, but then the whole time she's got to worry about, but what do I do with them? She can't fully be herself. There's something that she says here about, I'm more ancient, if you really want to know. And this makes me think back to the scene where they're looking at the exposition of Jerusalem. And I forgot to mention it, but I'll mention it now. The next day, in front of her class, she drew the entire thing on the board. And Phillotson is really impressed by this because he knows that he couldn't do that. And he also knows that she barely even looked at it. So either we have to assume that she has either a photographic memory and is just, able to do things like that. Could be possible. Or I think this is more likely, because I think this is what Hardy's trying to get us to see, is that Sue does know what she's talking about in being religious. She does know a lot of what Jude knows. She likes to present herself as a non-believer and agnostic, and she kind of in a moment you'll see like what Jude wants her to say his prayers with her, to say prayers with them and do what he would normally do at night, and she's like, I'll watch you. I don't want to feel like a hypocrite. But there's something about her that that she does seem to have the understanding. Was that forced on her, or was it because she was interested in it? And I think you'll see as it progresses, when she's talking about something that's ancient, she's really talking about something that's orthodox, that's going before these periods of restoration. And remember, there's a lot of Hardy in Sue. So a lot of contradiction is going to come out in her. And I think Hardy's he's having a good time with it. To think about it, if Sue is so secure in her beliefs, why is she so guilty all the time? Why does she constantly point out that there's something bad in me? As if she's pointing just the way Jude's pointing to himself about original sin. And that she wants to be good. She wants to be right. And so, but circumstances, because it's a tragic story, they keep, it interferes. For instance, so when they get to see each other next and they decide to go to this castle, it's really far. He suggests they go to this castle, and she says, Warder, it's this Gothic ruins. I hate Gothic. And if you remember that quote I sent, that Hardy looked back at the Gothic architecture in horror because it didn't restore the more ancient, tradition. It sort of took a style of its own. And he says that it is a classic building, Corinthian, I think. And she says, oh, I like the sound of Corinthian. So again, we're getting more to an apostolic tradition. She doesn't like things to be changed. And I'll show you. So as they're traveling together, they're put in this compartment all by themselves. And because they assume that they're married. And Sue says, that's good intentions wasted. So, she cares about appearances. Like when Phillotson put his arm there, she's looking around nervously. Is anybody watching? Is anybody going to think that, we're doing something wrong? And in their trip, they go like 7 miles out of the way, and they think, well, we'll just catch the train back to Melchester. It'll be fine. But 7 miles ends up being too much for Sue. And then they come to this little cottage where she needs to rest. Back then you could just go into people's homes and stay the night. They would let you. And the guy there says, you're not going to catch that train tonight. You're going to have to stay here. And so it's kind of like, like a little cozy Airbnb situation, except you're with the family. And she's comfortable there. And she's, they're like out in the country. Nobody knows where they are. Of course, this is going to be problematic because she's got a curfew and she's not going to get back to school. But at the moment, she's really not even thinking about that. And she talks about how she likes this kind of life. And Jude really isn't buying it too much. He says, you only think you like it. You don't. You're quite a product of civilization, said Jude. A recollection of her engagement, reviving his soreness a little. So he's thinking, you're settling. You're getting married. You can't convince me that, you're not conventional. And she says, indeed I am not, Jude. I like reading and all of that, but I crave to get back to the life of my infancy and its freedom. Do you remember it so well? You seem to me to have nothing unconventional at all about you. Oh, haven't I? You don't know what's inside of me. What? The Ishmaelite. And so the Ishmaelite, if you've ever looked at the first line of Moby Dick, it says, call me Ishmael. What does it matter? It's an American journey. Names aren't important. I don't know who I am. You don't know who you are. And Ishmael is, a kind of a type of wanderer, disinherited, and he doesn't really have any roots, and that's how Sue is kind of seeing herself. But she also makes an interesting point, and I think this is, as they get to talking about Sue as somebody who is like a sexless person, and she talks about kind of a boyfriend that she had that was a student at Christminster. And so the question of her sex life, I guess, kind of comes up. But notice she says, I want to get back to the life of my infancy and its freedom. And I think what you'll find, what Sue has a real problem with sex because I think she thinks once you go there and once you submit your body, your soul is no longer free. You are tied to someone. And even in marriage, this is something that you'll see, she wants to be able to withhold. She wants to hold something of herself. Because once that happens, all that independence is gone. And it's over. And for her, there's something very unsettled about her. That's why she said, you don't know what's in me. There's the Ishmaelite, the one who wonders and doesn't actually get married and doesn't do these other things. But that's exactly what she's doing now. And that's always the conflict with Sue. Let me get into what happens while she's gone. The ladies are getting pretty suspicious. And they're already kind of suspicious of Jude. You'd see that the girls have commented that, hey, I'd run off with Jude if I could. And they're not really buying the whole cousin thing either. This might have been something like people said all the time. Oh, he's my cousin. He's young. She's young. They look like a couple. So the people who are running the school are getting very frustrated with Sue at this point because she's not come back. And as far as they know, she's out with this guy. And they're going to find out who he is, and they're going to find out some background. In fact, they're going to say this young man was discharged from his work at Christminster for drunkenness and blasphemy in public houses, in the bars. Remember, he was reading the Nicene Creed in a bar. And he's come here to live entirely to be near her. No one is buying that Jude just came here to work because he could work anywhere. He's following her. And so that becomes apparent to people. And like I said before, your reputation during this time mattered. You could say it doesn't matter to me, but it mattered because if people didn't trust you, if you had something in your past, any little scheme in your past, they wouldn't hire you. So you might not be able to live somewhere. It would be like trying someone who has a felony and they're trying to get an apartment or a job and build their life, and yet they're always going to have this one thing. Well, you don't need a felony at this time. You just need to go get too drunk and make a fool of yourself to be ruined. If you remember, Jude was worried at a very young age when he was supposed to scare off the birds, and he fed them instead, and he got in trouble, and he thought, I've disgraced myself before I even got out there and had a shot. I've already ruined myself. But let me go back to what Hardy thinks about the women. This is how he describes the women at this school. They formed a pretty suggestive, pathetic sight of those of whose pathos and beauty they were themselves unconscious, and would not discover till, amid the storms and strains of after years, with their injustice, loneliness, childbearing, and bereavement, their minds would revert to this experience as to something which had been allowed to slip past them insufficiently. That last part reminds me of the poem that I've mentioned before about his marriage. Never were two souls wasted in their prime. These girls are in their prime. They're in their 20s. This is when you're the most, according to Hardy, this is when you're the most beautiful, and you can't even be really conscious of it. because they are, you know, have to put their hair back. They have to wear, you know, high collars. They have to, you know, look a certain way during a time when it should be like liberation, freedom. What do they have to look forward to after they pass this time of their early 20s? The loneliness of being a mother at home, the fear of a child dying. Sometimes the mothers would die at birth, giving birth. The mortality rate for infants was very high during this time. It sounds like a lot of sorrow and a lot of pain. And that is what Hardy, I think, is most concerned with. And I think he was that way. I think he felt that way because of his mother, too, because he saw a lot of, his mother was very smart and had a lot of potential. And it's almost like he almost kind of feels guilty for being the kid, you know, that is now tying her to him. And there's nothing really that his mother can do with her life but be a mother. But that's the way it was for everybody. And so Hardy saw that, and he saw it as being, you know, just like education being a problem, he saw that also as being a problem. So anyways, when Sue gets back there, she is disciplined, and they put her in isolation. The other girls did not like this. They thought they were being too cruel to Sue. She's obviously well liked. And so they try to kind of like put her in this bit of a prison, and she runs away. She escapes, and she runs through, it is cold, and she goes through a river, basically, and she goes straight to Jude's house. So they're out looking for her, and they don't know if Sue just went and committed suicide, because, you know, people did that at the river. So they don't know if she drowned herself. So the mind of the matron was horrified, not so much at the possible death of Sue, as at the possible half column detailing the event in all the newspapers. This would make news. Everybody would read about it. And it would add to a scandal to the school, would give the college an inevitable notoriety for many months to come. It would just look really bad. So if she's dead, it's not that great of a loss to them. It is the reputation. It's always the reputation with these people. So she comes to him, and she's freezing. She's just been in the river. And so he kind of sneaks her in, and then he knows she's got to get her wet clothes off. And so he says, maybe you could wear my Sunday suit, which kind of makes it a little interesting now, because now Sue she's out of this, you know, very conservative dress, and she's wearing like slacks, which you normally do, and like a guy's suit. It's kind of interesting look for her. And he gives her brandy, and she's actually getting a little tipsy and starts to talk. Actually, I think first she falls asleep for a little bit, but then when he comes back with some tea and she's had some food, she's in a very kind of almost hyper and high-spirited mood. And so she wants to go back and have this conversation that they had the other day. You called me a creature of civilization or something, didn't you? She said, breaking the silence. It was very odd you should have done that. Why? Well, because it's provokingly wrong. I am sort of a negation of it. You're very philosophical. A negation is profound talking. And he finds out, she goes off and she lists all these people she's read, like it's nothing. Oh, and I have studied Greek and Latin. And he's kind of like, oh my gosh, you've read more than I have. And how did you get to some of these people, especially like she mentions Swinburne and some guys like that? And this is when she tells him about her, I don't know, it's just friend, but I think we can assume that it was probably a boyfriend. And he was a college student, and she says that he asked me to live with him, and I agreed by letter. But when I joined him in London, I found that he meant different than from what I meant. He wanted me to be his mistress, in fact, and I wasn't in love with him. And on my saying I should go away if he didn't agree to my plan, so he did. So he came home merely to die, his death caused by terrible remorse in me for my cruelty, though I hope he died of consumption and not of me entirely. He left me a little money because I broke his heart, I suppose. That's how men are, so much better than women. And she makes comments like that a lot. What she's romanticizing here is that this guy is just a hopeless romantic. And Jude is very similar. And you can kind of see it almost as a foreshadowing of, you know, I'm glad he didn't completely die because of me, but, you know, I'm sure I had something to do with it. I broke his heart, you know, because I wouldn't give in to him. And, you know, he became miserable after that and just died. And then listen to what she says at the end of here. Jude says, however you've lived, Sue, I believe you're as innocent as you are unconventional. And she says, but I have never yielded myself to any lover, if that's what you mean. I have remained as I began. I quite believe you, but some women would not have remained as they began. Perhaps not. Better women would not. People say I must be cold-natured, sexless, on account of it. But I won't have it. Some of the most erotic poets have been the most self-contained in their daily lives. So she's saying that other women who would have lost their virginity and potentially been, quote, ruined, that's the term people used. In fact, Hardy had a poem called The Ruined Maid, and it's kind of funny in a way, but it's also kind of sad. But why would those women be superior to Sue? I think that what she's saying is there is a part of her that isn't as free as she would like to be, even if there's consequences for it. Because if those women did it because they were being true to themselves at that moment, then fine, great. But like I said, she likes to withhold herself. It doesn't necessarily, and I think what she doesn't want to sound like I'm completely a prude. There's these erotic poets who have been self-contained. But why are they being self-contained? I think it was St. Gregory of Nyssa who talks about virginity and so forth. And by the way, when Jude is reading up on divinity, when he's reading the Fathers, this is what he's reading. People like St. Gregory of Nyssa or St. John Chrysostom. And one of the things he says about the problem with having any kind of sexual relationship is that you have all these other things that go with it. You have infatuation, you have jealousy. What if they die? I mean, there's a part of you that can't be completely yourself anymore and have this closeness that you may have with God if you're constantly being distracted by these other things and these relationships that are driving you crazy. And she wants to go back to her infancy. She wants to go back to where she began, how she began, before she was tied to anybody else. It almost kind of reminds me of the course I did on Catcher in the Rye, and people think Catcher in the Rye so bad because it has bad language and he talks about sex. And what they miss is that he's afraid of sex. And that he because he associates that with growing up. He doesn't want to have to do that. He even says it's kind of crummy or uses the word dirty. It's not, he's not ready. And Sue is not, it doesn't mean that she completely lacks these desires, but she understands that there's a part of her that's going to be gone once it happens. What's done, it's done. And that way of withholding herself is the only way for her to protect her independence. But yet, you know, it's not going to last very long because she's engaged. I mean, eventually she's going to have to, which is also a very sad thing, but we'll get there. Anyways, listening to this other guy, as anybody would feel when someone tells you about their history, and it makes Jude a little depressed. And he says she seemed to get further and further away from him with her strange ways and curious unconsciousness of gender, which is, she's in guy's clothes right now. Why doesn't she understand her place? Why is she crossing these lines? And Sue says, aren't you really vexed with me, dear Jude? And there was another long silence. He felt that she was treating him cruelly, though he could not quite say in what way. Her very helplessness seemed to make her so much stronger than he. And this is why Sue isn't completely innocent with Jude. She's no Arabella, but she's still going to play a little bit of these games with Jude as well. She's fully aware of how Jude feels for her. And it's almost as if she'll give a little bit, flirt a little bit, and then she'll take it away. And then she'll, seem really interested and like, you're my dearest friend, and then she can be cold again. So it's very much a back and forth with Sue. So then they get on the subject of religion. He says, normally at this time I'm doing my prayers and reading scripture. And she says, you go ahead. I don't want to. I don't want to look like a hypocrite. I can't do that. I'll watch you do it. And, she's sort of teasing him, and he can tell that, she is teasing him for it. And he reminds her, that he still wants to be ordained. And she says, then you haven't given up the idea. I thought perhaps you have by this time. Of course not. I fondly thought at first that you felt as I do about it, as you were so mixed up in Christminster, Anglicanism, and Mr. Phillotson. And she says, I have no respect for Christminster whatever, except in qualified degree. On its intellectual side, said Sue Brighthead earnestly, my friend I spoke of, that he took it out of me. He was the most irreligious man I ever knew, and the most moral. The intellect at Christminster is new wine into old bottles. And so that's making an allusion to Matthew. And what does that mean exactly? New wine in old bottles. The new wine in context of what Jesus is talking about is that this is, if you just go back to the very first inscription of the book, the letter killeth, but the Spirit lives. The purpose of the New Testament is to fulfill the Old Testament, not to be stuck in a legalistic view, but to be liberated. But that's not happening at Christminster because of it being more legalistic, their lack of freedom in a way. And notice when she says that he was the most irreligious man I ever knew and the most moral. this, I think what Hardy's talking about right here and what he does with Sue is he's talking about a movement that was very popular with among his colleagues and people like John Stuart Mill, and that is positivism. And let me just give you just a this is from Pite's Guarded Life of Hardy. Positivism could no longer accept the supernatural aspects of Christian doctrine. The belief that Jesus was the Son of God and that he worked miracles, they nonetheless believed that people could act as Christ acted. Positivists looked for the human Christ. People could become Christ to one another in the moments when they behaved with selfless love. So this sounds like a really great idea. If you're not really like Hardy was, as connected to the church, you could just believe in some of the things Jesus said and dismiss everything else and see him as a great teacher, and that we will be Christ to each other. And I don't think that this has ever quite gone away. I think that the moral will be more moral than anybody else. That sometimes even that becomes another way of being judgmental. And but you see, this is problematic for someone like Hardy, because if you don't believe, then it's not a problem. But if you do believe, then now you have to pick and choose. And I think Hardy, as attractive as that would have been, because on one extreme there's legalism, on the other extreme there's we'll just take what's useful out of the Bible and dismiss everything else, and that's okay. And it does kind of become, I think, once the church divides and continues to divide, and people start to kind of decide for themselves what a Christian really believes, and let's make it as simple and basic as possible. And it sounds like a great idea, but it's also very problematic to dismiss half of what's in the Bible. So at any rate, going back to Christminster, Sue says it's an ignorant place except for the townspeople, artisans, drunkards, the paupers. She said, perverse still at his differing from her. They see life as it is, of course. Now remember the other one, when he's at the bar and he's looking at people at Christminster, he said, these are the real people of Christminster. This is what Christminster is. And she's basically making the same observation. You prove it in your own person. You're one of the very men Christminster was intended for when the colleges were founded. A man with a passion for learning, but no money or opportunity or friends. But you were elbowed at the pavement by the millionaire's son. And in a way that sounds very similar. Like even in today's, do what I want you to do. And he's asking, will you pray with me or read scripture? She says, no, I'll watch you. And then he's reading scripture, and she comes back and says, Jude, she said brightly, when she came back from reading the Bible, when he came, that's my parentheses, will you let me make you a New Testament, like the one I made for myself at Christminster? And it's just kind of an interesting idea. She says, I altered my old one by cutting up all the epistles and gospels into separate brochures and rearranging them in chronological order as written, beginning with the book of Thessalonians, following with the epistles, and putting the gospels much further on. So, like I said before, there's definitely a part of Sue that, nobody forced her to learn all of this. She kind of did this on her own. And I think that sort of shows, even though there's doubts and she wants, to be seen more as agnostic. I think there's a part of her that really does believe and feels kind of passionate about it, because she does contradict herself so much. And well, just as a note on Thessalonians, I mean, it was the first book to be written down, but that doesn't mean that that's how it historically happened, because the epistles were written by Paul, and Paul preached Christ crucified. You need the Gospels before that. And, and the other thing is, you have to keep in mind is that the Apostle Paul didn't know he was writing Scripture. He had no clue that there was going to be this book that people were going to put together. And, he was just writing letters. And the reason why Matthew in particular is one of the first books is because Matthew is what I think scholars call the formulaic prophecy, which is where, especially pertaining to the birth of Christ, where you have the prophecies, the fulfillment of the New Testament. And the New Testament is about the fulfillment. So it would make sense that Matthew, which goes over more detail with the prophecies, around the birth of Christ, would be first. So it wouldn't exactly be like chronological order in the way she's saying, but just in the way that as far as like when they were written down. And then she says something about Song of Solomon, which is interesting, because if you know anything about Song of Solomon, it's like a poem, like a love letter, and it's a Jewish text. And she says that I won't say anymore, except that people have no right to falsify the Bible. I hate such humbug as could attempt to plaster over ecclesiastical abstractions such a static natural love as lies in that great passionate song. So basically saying the fathers who interpret this are ruining it. What I insist on is that to explain such verses as "Whither is thy beloved gone, O thou fairest among women," by the note, "The church professeth her faith," is supremely ridiculous. And I think the only way to really understand this is to actually look at the footnotes. And this is from the Oxford Bible. I looked at the Orthodox one, and I felt like I'm probably going to be too biased here, so I'm going to just go with the Orthodox one. And it says, this in the Jewish liturgy, Song of Songs, excuse me, I've been kind of sick, is read during the celebration of Passover. The traditional symbolic understanding remained dominant in Jewish interpretation until the modern period. So the Christian explanation is they're trying to make this more as relating to God and the church, except for the Christian church didn't quite exist yet. So the Christian development as a symbolic or allegorical interpretation, reading song as an account of Christ's love for the church, and later as an expression of the soul's spiritual with God. Over the centuries, many commentators and homilists, from Origen to St. John the Cross, have developed an allegorical interpretation. That's what she doesn't like, is trying to fit it in to this context, is what she is saying doesn't work. But what's interesting is it says even among the Protestant reformers, some form of allegorical interpretation remained dominant until the rise of historical criticism in the 18th century. So the reason why it's so curious to me is because I'm trying to understand where Thomas Hardy's coming from. And this is where he's coming from. Okay, and that's why that remark, as small as it may seem, it's getting us back to who Sue really is and how she thinks. and it turns out she thinks an awful lot like Hardy. Okay, I know I've gone on so long that I'm losing my voice here. So I'm going to wrap it up and I will finish with this, maybe with this whole part the next time. Maybe not be this ambitious next time. I don't know, but I'll see you later. Okay, thanks. Bye.